Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on climate finance for grid investments in emerging and developing economies. I'm Abhishek Shivakumar. I work for CCG and Loughborough, and also spend some of my time with the UN. I really feel lucky to be able to participate in this group for the last many months. That's culminated in this study, a study that provides an overview of the current status of climate finance for grid investments. So just to give you an overview of today's running order, so we're going to start with two speakers, both of them online. The first is Monica Gullberg, who is a senior renewable energy specialist at the Green Climate Fund. So she'll be providing a kind of overview on the need for climate finance for grid investments. And this will be followed by Steve Pye, who is an associate professor in energy systems at University College London. So we'll have these two speakers first, and then we'll follow this with a panel discussion where Monica will join four other panel members in a panel discussion. So, throughout the session, please feel free to post questions on Slido using the code that Carla provided. And with that, yes, we'll get started with Monica's presentation first. Thanks.
So I guess you hear me now? Okay, and the first slide is there, and and you see my background also. Here am I from the Green Climate Fund in Korea. I'm happy to be invited and to be part of this group who has been working hard on coming up with some new ideas. The Green Climate Fund is the world's largest climate fund. We're set up by the UNFCCC, and we serve the Paris Agreement. And what we do is we support developing countries in their transition to low emission, climate resilient societies. So, and we work based on country collaboration. It's country driven. We seek to be an open partnership organizations. We have partnerships with accredited entities. We have a balance. We aim to have a balanced portfolio, 50-50 adaptation and mitigation. And we do have a range of financing instruments, equity, grants, loans, and guarantees. And here you are, loans, guarantees, equity, grants. The current portfolio that we have we can blend our financial contributions. So in a specific initiative or investment, we can blend between loans and grants and guarantees, and equity, which is very beneficial in most cases. Many others are confined to one or two different instruments. We have 8 result areas. We work with grids, energy supply, access, and grids. That's the first result area. Transport, buildings and cities, forestry and ecosystems. And then on the adaptation side, livelihoods, people and communities, health, food, water security, infrastructure and the built environment, and ecosystems and ecosystem services. So in this particular case, when we're talking about grids, my understanding or interpretation is that we're working with energy access, we're working with energy generation, different mixes. We're also working with transport in the sense that we're looking at the transport sectors potentially more electrification in the transport sector. Of course, we're looking at building and cities. They are main user of electricity. And of course, we're looking at infrastructure in resilience in the built infrastructure, which is then the resilient grids, basically, and ability to kickstart after hazards and stuff like that. So we're spreading over many result areas, even though it's a very specific technical area, grids. So we do have like 10 different sector guides under development. Some are public and some are underway. I think the energy one has been out for 2 consultation rounds. So there are 3 main areas that we suggest are central for moving the energy agenda just now. And this is a low emission generation, reliant and efficient and reliant grids, both transmission and distribution, but including also storage, and of course including also flexibility. And then thirdly, to really keep working on the access to clean energy. So you can see that one of our goals is specifically to finance grids. And this is just a recap. This is from the International Energy Agency assessment of financing gaps and needs, where it's clear that for emerging markets and developing economies, we're investing far too little. We're currently investing like $75 billion worldwide in electricity networks and nothing in battery and storage. I mean, nothing if you count in billion US dollars. And to reach at the net zero emission scenario, the estimate is we need to invest 299 billion and 26 billion respectively annually. So that's a huge gap. So I'm jumping to GCF's investment criteria here, because we have, of course, we have different organizations have different finance, and we need to make things happen. But the way we work in GCF is we have 6 investment criteria. We don't have what you normally call eligibility criteria or so. We do assess based on country needs, but we do assess against these 6 criteria, and they are mitigation or adaptation impact. We want to reach at a high impact in the sector and a change towards something that we some visionary change. We do want to contribute to sustainable development, so that we contribute to job creation, we contribute to gender equality. So even though that's not really just a climate issue, we value that. We always work and value the needs of the recipient in terms of financial needs, but or other needs that they express. Country ownership is important for us, and you may know then, of course, you know that in each country they have their national designated authority, and they have their protocol and communication with UNFCCC. So basically that's what we are supporting. And of course we want our investments to be efficient and effective, just like any other investor. So we're looking at minimum concessionality and value for money, maybe, if you want to put it that way. Okay, so maybe I jumped a bit quick there, because why are we interested to work with this group and on this paper and the methodology? I would say basically because it's shown very difficult to finance grids. We don't have many proposals that address grid investments, and with the few different that we have had, which are very good, they are all good, but we don't see that we have a common assessment methodology or a common method for doing an ex-ante estimate of the impact and the justification of the investment in the grid for each different case. You can have different types of justification. Either you're investing in a grid specifically for a specific power plant, a utility scale investment, which needs then some upgrading in that specific branch, or you're aiming to do an interregional interconnection, or you have a sea cable between an island and another island. So there are many different cases, and we think in order to attract finance that it's good if we can come up with some simplicity and some clear guidance to investors. What is it that we are looking for, and what would be valuable and paradigm shifting projects, and how can you estimate the impact, and how can you monitor the impact? So the question then that I have, and that I think this group also had somehow, I'm not saying that everyone needs to, not every climate investor needs to have a very specific quantification of the impact. But somehow it boils down to it, because the countries have their communication on their goals in their NDC, their mitigation goals. So when they apply for funding, climate funding from us at least, they have to show that there's a need for this, and there is an additionality component, which basically says there is no other investor in this project, and it will lead to some impact in terms of climate mitigation or climate resilience then, if you're talking about climate resilient grid investments. So somehow in an early stage, there needs to be a way of taking some, I would say, political or directional strategic decisions. So the national designated authority would like to have a feeling or an understanding of when, why, and how is it a climate priority to invest in grids. And what is the order of magnitude impact in terms of climate resilience and greenhouse gas mitigation for that specific investment, and that might come up for discussion at the NDA's table, and he or she has to compare that then with many other climate investments, both mitigation and adaptation in that specific country. And then for the project developer and for the investor, I would say the perspective is a little bit different. They would like to understand how they can source financing, what type of financing is available for this type of investment. So that's another reason for us to be a little bit transparent and clear about how we think. I write then what branch praxis can be used to classify the investment as green. And I know in this session that we have a number of talented and experienced people with different, and you can have different classification for different financing. Of course, every financier have their own. But if you think of, for example, CDM or any other common general applied method, that's very helpful. So if there was a common method for investing in green grids, I think that would be very helpful. And then more into the details. When we've decided to do this investment and we're starting to do the planning and the budgeting and so forth, we'll have to do some assumptions on the mitigation. We'll have to estimate ex ante on the mitigation impact and resilience impact. So then we're there back into how do we do this? What's the praxis? How brave can we be to, how many years before us can we project and guess about different investments and different branches development? Yes, so in summary, we're positive to this methodological paper because it sheds light on these questions and hopefully can contribute to making more money flow into grids, including our money. So, like I said, we are the world's largest climate fund. We can use many different instruments. We work based on the country's needs. We have to somehow motivate our investments with that they are justified, they are additional, and that they clearly contribute to climate adaptation and mitigation, or climate mitigation or adaptation. So we all understand, and we really value from our end also, we do understand that grids can enable low emission electricity for more end users. So it's low emission, it's access. That's clear. And the flexible, reliable power grids are needed for energy transition. That's also clear. But we need to pace up that, and therefore we are very happy to have a group of researchers work on a method, and hopefully that can help AEs and countries to put forward proposals to us on investing in grids that we can accept. So that's in summary what I wanted to say, and I welcome the discussion. Thank you. Thank you. This is one project. We'll take that another time.
Thank you very much, Monica. So we'll take questions at the end. I see a lot of them on Slido already. So maybe we'll move on to Steve's presentation next. So Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much, Abby. One second, I'm just trying to work out my controls here. Okay, got it. Yeah, so it's a real pleasure to be with you all, and thank you so much for. I'm just trying to find my slides actually before I start. Okay, here we go. Great. Yeah, pleasure to be here with you and to talk about this new paper that we've been working on in collaboration with the working group on climate finance. It's been a 5-month collaboration in which we've had some really good discussions, and a lot of issues have been raised in this area about how we motivate and increase climate finance for grid investments, particularly in emerging and developing economies. I mean, the starting point is given, and Monica's provided the context, given the importance of grid infrastructure for decarbonisation, how do we mobilise the necessary climate finance for such projects? So we looked at 4 key things within this paper. Firstly, the investment challenge facing the international community with respect of net zero and 1.5 degrees. Then we reviewed the approaches of organisations concerning eligibility of investment for climate finance. Then went on to consider actually what do these approaches mean for mobilising finance going forward? Are they, what's the expectation in terms of how they can mobilise that finance? And then finally, we proposed a number of proposals for increasing prospects for grid-focused climate finance going forward in conclusion. So just to come back to the scale of the investment challenge, I mean, Monica's already mentioned this, but just to highlight again, this really excellent work by the International Energy Agency that really showed what kind of scale-up's required for investments to both decarbonize existing systems, but to meet the increased expected growing demand in electricity. So we can see that, so basically overall grid infrastructure is around $300 billion. per year, about 2/3 on distribution and 1/3 on transmission. And this IEA net zero scenario pushes this up towards 800 billion by 2026 to 2030, so over 160% increase, which is huge. The graph on the right-hand side shows the investment needs, particularly for emerging markets and developing economies, which again sees the increase moving from 70 billion to over 300 billion in the 2030 period. And essentially, this means that by 2030, due to the much higher level of increased scaling in the EMDE regions, the share of investment overall increases from 25 to 40%. So it's particularly, I mean, obviously, overall, the increases are huge, but particularly for this EMDE region, we see a particularly large increase. So we also looked at what the climate finance for grid investments was today. And this, according to OECD definitions, is at around 3 billion overall. But of course, it's hoped very much that this will scale significantly in the future. And basically, we see that the flow of the flow of finance from providers on the left-hand side of this figure to recipients on the right-hand side, and we can see that this 3 billion is broken down into different components. So we can see that about 88% is based on debt instruments, and the rest is from grants. In terms of the sort of largest funders, we can see that that's Germany, France, and Japan. And in terms of institutions, that's organizations such as the World Bank and EBRD. And in terms of the largest recipients, there's about 1 billion going to Asia and 1 billion going to Africa. So in recent years, different organizations, including financing institutions, have been developing approaches on how to assess whether a grid project investment counts as climate finance. And of course, this is important as funders and investors seek to make climate-friendly investments. But it's challenging, I think, as Monica alluded to, as grids are more or less enablers of decarbonisation, not mitigation actions in themselves. So within this paper, we've reviewed two of the sort of key approaches out there. The first is the EU taxonomy, which is really developed by the European Commission to look at these issues from a European Union perspective. And what the EU taxonomy looks at is whether projects in a system are eligible based on whether that current system is decarbonising. So they use this term full decarbonisation. So what that basically means is that grid investments will be eligible if that system is at a point of time has a very low carbon intensity. So they use a threshold of 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. And they also look at a secondary criteria which says something around whether the new capacity additions that are coming on the system, whether 67% of them meet this threshold of 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour as well. So there's those two criteria. And then on the other side of this table, we have the common principles, which have been developed by the multilateral development banks and the IDFC. And attribution, this is looking at attribution of grid investment as climate finance based on the share of low carbon generation in the future. So this is more of a forward-looking approach to see what has been planned in respect of the system. So if the system in 2030, for example, in 10 years' time, is at 30% low carbon generation, that is the level of climate finance attribution that's given to the investment. There is a different criteria if indeed the investment is dedicated to the evacuation of renewables in its entirety, then that investment becomes fully eligible. So there's a number of these different approaches out there, but these are sort of two of the key ones that are being sort of taken forward at the moment, and have had a huge amount of work put into them to develop those in recent years. So these are fairly new approaches and are sort of starting to be applied now, having been recently published. So what we did, we looked at these different approaches, and then we did some analysis to determine the extent to which these approaches might enable investments to be designated as climate finance across different regions. So what we found is that the EU taxonomy is quite restrictive, and that's not surprising given that this is a taxonomy that was developed for the European Union. So we see that, you know, given the criteria that grids need to be below 100 grams of CO2, we look across the world and we see that only 4% of current grids are in that space, and more than half of the generation out there, generation systems, remain above 500 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. The other criteria in the EU taxonomy is around recent capacity additions, but that doesn't really appear to change the picture of this being quite a sort of restricted approach in many regions of the world. For the common principles, this uses criteria around the planned share of low carbon generation, as we see, and you can see on the right-hand side a map which shows the kind of levels of climate finance attribution in different regions, and you can see the sort of lighter colors suggest higher levels of attribution in parts of Latin America and Africa in particular. However, many of the countries have much lower attribution. So in countries that account for 80% of generation in these emerging markets and developing economies, the share of climate finance for grid investments would only be around 40%. So you can see that in the bottom right-hand corner in the chart that plots generation against climate attribution, and of course that's biased to some extent by China accounting for 40% of that generation. But there's a question, I think, as to whether, you know, at levels of around 40% attribution, whether institutions would be looking to take those projects forward if that's the level of attribution they can give towards climate finance. We then applied these eligibility levels we had mapped out onto the investment level required under the IEA's net zero scenario. And we found that less than 40% of the required investment level in grid projects in 2040 would likely qualify as climate finance under the common principles, with a much lower level under the EU taxonomy. And we've marked on the charts those different figures in terms of the total the total investment needs. So the blue bars show what we've considered to be eligible based on our fairly simple approach, and the orange bars being the total investment required. And this just gives a flavor of the applicability, I suppose, of these different approaches and how they play out across different regions of the world. So I suppose the challenge is that, you know, this could constrain efforts to mobilize large-scale financing needed and potentially steer investment away from countries who most need it to decarbonize. So what we tried, so we having done that analysis, so that sort of looking at the investment challenge, reviewing the sort of current approaches out there, and then doing a bit of analysis to explore what that meant. In the last part of the paper, we kind of considered how to increase funding for grid infrastructure via climate finance with a focus on two different areas. So the first sort of speaks to the existing approaches that are out there and maybe adjustments that could be made, you know, with regards to those existing approaches. And the second part talks more to what Monica was saying about the needs of climate funds going forward. So we first reflected on the potential to revisit specific criteria used in the common principles approach, which is the most relevant to the EMDE context. So we're not talking about the EU taxonomy, we're talking about the common principles. So there are two key issues flagged here. So the first one is that current climate finance attribution is based on the overall system share of low carbon generation at the end of the planning period. And one proposal which follows in the kind of follows off the back of what the AFD have done, and Pauline is here so she can speak to this during the panel discussion. But maybe that the criteria could be broadened to specifically credit the share of renewable generation added to the system during the planning period. So not just looking at the final share, but looking at giving more weight to those capacity additions that those low carbon capacity additions that are put onto the system over that planning period, which would weight significantly more in favor of low carbon generation if that was what was coming on primarily onto the system. So so just to summarize on that point, so eligibility, not just on the final system share of low carbon generation, but also on the share of added generation that is low carbon. The second point relates to the other part of the criteria, which says that projects that are dedicated to the evacuation of only low carbon electricity are fully eligible. And the interpretation of this is that it infers a single project that connects low carbon generation to the system only. Now, this could be broadened to projects that are potentially necessary, meaning that such projects could be eligible by increasing system capacity to allow for more renewables, even if they're not dedicated infrastructure only for the transmission of renewable energy. So it's kind of looking for more flexibility around the interpretation of the term dedicated to maybe refocus on what is necessary. So the second area that we looked at more speaks to the role of climate funds in this space. So we wanted to consider thinking about approaches to capture wider appraisal criteria that's relevant to climate funds that Monica spoke about. Now, as has been said, climate funds play a crucial role in the provision of concessionary finance to help increase investment in countries that really need it. So approaches to assessing project investment for such funds are needed and are currently not in place. Now, there are existing approaches, as we've discussed, around climate finance eligibility, but such as the common principles, but these are less relevant in the case of such organizations, as funds such as GCF only fund climate projects. So eligibility is less of an interest. So as Monica suggested, there's a wider set of criteria that the climate funds and similar organizations need to consider when they're thinking about prioritization of financing. And this includes impacts on emission reductions, other sustainable development goals, whether it meets country demand and need, and whether it's effective use of funds relative to other priorities. So it's a much broader set of criteria, which the existing approaches don't necessarily need to consider. So in this paper, we proposed an ex-ante modeling-based approach that uses a standardized, rapidly deployable modeling framework that can be easily applied to different geographies where they might be interested in inputting financing. And this allows for estimates of some of these relevant indicators that we've mentioned that are needed to assess these different projects and programs. And then, we also mentioned in the paper that for more complex, high investment level projects, there could be more detailed analysis using power systems, modeling analysis that can better assess system operation under different scenarios. Now, of course, with any kind of modeling approach, there are issues around data. If we're to apply a sort of common approach across many different geographies, there's always this issue around data and whether there is the data to support the modeling going forward. So, this could be an area that maybe hampers modeling work, but also an area that people can come together and work out what that common approach could be in terms of this ex ante analysis. And I think, one of the roles of maybe this working group going forward could be to think about issues around data, working with international organizations like the IEA and IRENA. But we think, based on our paper, that there is enough standardized data sets to be able to do something in this area of ex ante analysis that meets the needs of climate funds such as GCF. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. Just to say, if you want additional information on this particular report, please get in contact with myself or Abhishek. The published paper is available online, so please feel free to download that and review that. Just to also thank the working group members whose discussion really contributed to some of the issues that we've flagged in this report. This is by no means the final say on the matter. This is simply a paper that raises some of these sort of key issues and hopefully reflects some of the sort of key areas of discussion that we've had over the last 5 months. So I will finish there, Abhishek. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Steve and Monica earlier. So next we'll start the panel discussion, but before we go into the panel discussion, I just want to say that one of the top voted questions on Slido is not even really a question, it just their words of encouragement, saying amazing to see all these organizations working together, thank you. So maybe on that positive note, we can get into the panel discussion. So I'm very kind of excited to introduce our panel members. So starting with those who we have in person over here. So first is Jan-Willem van der Ven, who is the head of climate finance and carbon markets at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And then we have Christophe McGlade, who is the head of the energy supply unit at the International Energy Agency. And then joining us online, we have Pauline Larat, who's the deputy head of the energy unit at the French Development Agency, AFD. And we have Eugene Howard, who's the head of electricity networks division at the European Investment Bank. And joining them will be Monica Gullberg, who you heard from earlier, and then Steve and I will help moderate the session. We've had lots of discussions while developing this paper. There were very lively discussions, lots of areas of agreement and disagreement, but all of them were educational. So I'm hoping that we'll have some of that in this panel discussion as well. So maybe if I could start with some questions from my side, and then maybe we can go to the audience questions after that. So the first question I had is quite a broad one. Just your reflections on the study, and more broadly, how do we scale up project finance for grid investments as outlined in the IEA scenarios? So currently a total of 300 billion is what is spent on grid investments, but only 3 billion of that is designated as climate finance. So how do we kind of bridge that gap? What's the reason for that gap? What role can concessional finance play? So maybe, I'll open it up to the panel. Just please raise your hand if you want to go first. Or, just indicate if you want to go first. Yeah, sure. So Eugene's hand, go up first, please.
Yes.
Eugene.
Hi there. I think maybe to help the audience understand things a little bit, because we're talking about methodologies and how to increase the climate finance. One of the things that we have to keep in mind is that electricity network infrastructure is really and it has been said, an enabling infrastructure. It's rarely directly responsible for reductions in CO2 emissions. And they serve multiple purposes. We have is grid stability, reliability, etc. So it's very difficult to tease out the investments which are related or ought to be related to climate, and those that are not. They're meeting supply and demand, and they're not driving these forces. They are responding to the forces of installing new generation in the case of renewables and decarbonisation, in electricity demand by consumers through natural economic growth, as well as electrification and rural electrification, so electrification of the economy in order to decarbonize. So it is a reactionary type of investment. It leads, but it leads in terms of planning. So when you look at, say, there's only 3 billion in investments now which are climate related, it's not too surprising, because when you look at the rates of decarbonization in the countries, those investments haven't yet been made. As the increase of renewables becomes more and more evident, then of course more investments in the grid need to be made to connect to them. As the economy is decarbonized and become more electrified, greater investments in the grid need to be made in order to accommodate that. So, I think that the gap is real, but it also represents where we are today in decarbonization and where we want to go, and what is necessary to achieve it, rather than a gap as if these investments are needed already at this moment. Remember, they are made in conjunction with the connection of renewables and the electrification of the economy. So I think that gap is real, but I think we should keep in mind, what it represents, and it is a forward-looking view as to what net investments need to be made in the system in order for these economies to decarbonize, together with generation and electrification in the economy. I wanted to make that point clear, and that the types of investments are very hard to tease out, because they serve multiple functions, and this is why these approaches are a bit different. I'll leave the floor for others as well to discuss maybe about the type of financing requirements.
Thanks very much, Eugene. I think Pauline, I think you were next. Please.
Oops. Sorry, no, but I fully agree with what Eugene just said. Basically, I think we are really starting. It's a new issue. It's a new complex issue. The methodology for qualifying climate grid investment, because it has multiple services, as it was said, and so I guess we are starting all together this analysis and see what kind of reliable and harmonized methodology can be put in place to really scale up this kind of climate finance. But I fully agree with what Eugene already said, actually.
Thanks, Pauline. And then I think finally, Monica, please.
Thanks. My first response would be collaboration, just like we're doing now, to collaborate and to think and to contribute with different angles and features and money, different types of money. The other thing I would like to say here is the question was not only about climate finance, but finance. How do we scale up grid project finance? And generally, overall in the energy sector, we all know that we need to bring in also crowding in the private sector more than we've done so far. So to do that, I've been thinking also along the lines of tweaking maybe the PPAs, the standard PPAs a bit, so that an investor in the power plant is also motivated or incentivized to contribute to the grid. Just an idea. You could perhaps have local carbon markets or so around that, so that when you do, if you are an ambitious power generating entity, and you do invest in the grid as part of your investment, it can gain you, and you can sort of have a better deal with the utility than someone who didn't. So I think that's a way also of thinking how you can perhaps create some market for the private investors to be more ambitious. But I think first and foremost, the collaboration is central.
Yes, please.
So, where to start on these things? Let's say earlier this week, the MDBs made a statement with a number of action points. One of them was that we're going to scale up our support for long-term strategies to the countries. And I think that's a key point, because we want to sponsor the uptake of net zero commitments by countries, even see if we can, with our support and finance, can further accelerate that moment when they would hit the net zero. And then, of course, within that long-term strategy, energy systems will be key as to informing what needs to happen now, what needs to happen in the midterm, what needs to happen in the long term. Carbon pricing systems are, of course, key in order to ensure a differentiation between, let's say, carbon-intensive fuels and energy systems, and tilted towards the renewables and other non-emitting sources. As to infrastructure, so often the generation is not at the same place as the use. Although when I started living in London in 2003, I was living in a net zero house building, and now we are, let's say, 18 years further, and let's say I don't see the uptake of net zero buildings. So that's probably the first thing what needs to happen, the decarbonisation by avoiding the use in the houses and self-generation, etc. But going further, there will be still industry, transport, where the generation and the demand will need to be connected. There are, of course, electricity, and we all focus on electrification, but we also need to, and that's maybe further work, think a bit more long term as well, as to are there any other energy systems that can carry same amounts of energy but at lesser material use, because electricity infrastructure is quite material intensive compared to other forms like gas networks, etc., provided they are, of course, decarbonized. So once we then focus on the electricity transmission lines, the networks, in our countries where we work, and now the connection to finance, there's a lot of dialogue needed, and policy packages needed in order to make sure that we have cost recovery in the transport tariffs. And in a lot of countries that's not happening. And so we need to think about credit enhancement systems in order to, and concessional funding as well in a number of cases, in order to get through that first investment cycle, which then, with a high efficiency of the transmission line, would allow for cost recovery on, and maybe even, if designed well, a profitable system in which the private sectors would indeed become interested. But a lot of countries, this is not the case. We don't see the cost recovery, and so there's really necessary to focus on, with the energy regulators, for proper tariff reform. And of course, then one needs to deal with what are the consequences for consumers and the competitiveness of the industry. So these are all big questions, and there's a role for climate funds like the GCF to help to catalyze these processes And the end game is, of course, that we get an acceleration in the investments, in the infrastructure. We take away the concerns of, let's say, parties on the security of supply and so on. But we all need to keep on talking to each other, find out the best practices, and hopefully in 10 years' time this meeting has really contributed to the implementation and delivery. Thank you.
If I may just say a few words. First of all, congratulations on the paper to you and to Steve. I really enjoyed Steve's presentation and really enjoyed hearing from you. If I can, I'll make just a general point to begin with and then into a specific one on grids. The general point is that whenever we think through our net zero scenario, we have a high level number that we need to triple clean energy investment. So roughly speaking, over the past 5 years, total investment into clean energy has been about $1 trillion globally. And we need to get up from $1 trillion to $3 trillion by the end of this decade. Within that $3 trillion, you have some unequivocally green things. And to be honest, those we can easily identify them, whether it's wind, solar, things which absolutely deliver you net zero. But actually the majority of the investment which is required, the majority of that $2 trillion increase is into things which is much, much murkier, much more difficult and challenging to define. And there are different ways that you can split up the taxonomy. We've started talking about contingent investments and transition investments. So contingent are things like investing in electric vehicles. They don't necessarily deliver you net zero today, but if the electricity sector decarbonizes, they will give you net zero. Transition is things like investing into efficiency, so improving the efficiency of an existing building. It's good, it reduces emissions now, but you're going to have to do something else to that building, shifting from a gas boiler to a heat pump, something like that. And this is where grids comes into it, because grids fall into this tricky transition investment area. And we heard very clearly from what we're hearing there that the existing taxonomies don't necessarily drive the investment that's necessary into grids that we need to see. And it's very clear from our net zero scenario that investment into grids is going to be a major constraint for the deployment of unequivocally green things. That's why we have this quadrupling in investment into grids. We need to accept that some of the investment that is made into grids over this period, over the next 10 years, is going to lead to some increased fossil fuel use. The grids aren't currently zero carbon, they're not below 100 grams per kilowatt hour, as Steve was saying. So there will be some encouragement of fossil fuel investment. But if you don't have that investment into grids, you're not going to get the investment coming through on variable renewables coming through. And ultimately, you need to have that investment into grids before you will get all of the investment coming through on renewables. Grids are harder to do than, because of the great technological progress there's been on wind and solar, it's easier to get them off the ground now in many countries, in most countries, than it is on grids. So the specific point here on grids is that because we need to have this tripling, we need to identify the quadrupling, why we're not seeing that today. And we've heard a number of reasons as to why that is. Ultimately, this comes down to, in a number of emerging market and developing economies, it's utilities, state-owned enterprises that drive that investment, and many of them aren't financially viable today. So we need to kind of work with them, we need to encourage them, we need to kind of build that local capacity so that they become financially viable and make sure that we have the flows of investment, of finance into those countries to support those utilities so that in the future they can start to do these investments through their own balance sheet.
Great, yeah, thank you so much, Christophe. I don't know if there are any responses to that or if we should move to the next question. So, I mean, as always, I mean, I just end up learning so much from these discussions. Pauline, you were going to say,
just thank you. Yeah, just to confirm that we fully agree at EBRD on this diagnosis, and we believe that it is the mandate of Public Development Bank to strongly support governments in creating such enabling environments. and to enhance regulatory framework and provide long-term support for this kind of policy planning to enable private sector participation or the public utility to take the financing on its own balance sheet. But speaking to private sector also, especially when we talk about concessional finance, they need also to take their part when they consider an investment, and they need to accept to take more risk or to go to more innovative technologies as well to finance green investments. This is an AFD perspective as well on this issue.
Great. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Pauline. Yes, Monica. Yes, please.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to comment also on all of the nice input, but International Energy Agency also did some reasoning here on we will have to accept there's some increase in fossil fuels because we need to do these investments, and that's the kind of dilemma that we have also, because we're having not only the climate impact, but we also have the transformational and paradigm shifting goal, which means that we would be reluctant to support things like changing your heat pump or hybridization of power plants because it's not transitioning. Yes, you do decrease your mitigation a little bit, but that's not what we're talking about. We would like to see a transformational change. So I can agree with that thinking, but it then needs to be followed by some kind of agreed how can I say, method or praxis in trust or conditionality. What are we talking about here? How much do you need? I mean, if we're doing a 5 or 10 year plan, okay, we can accept that you don't get immediate results, but maybe you would like to get some results at the end. So I just wanted to allude to that thinking.
Yes.
I mean, just to perhaps build on that, because I fully agree with Monica that ultimately for all of these investments which are necessary, you need a credible path. You need to see that if you have some encouragement of fossil fuels in the next couple of years, that's not the long-term solution, that you have this transformation, that you have kind of the full shift towards net zero. And ultimately, I mean, one of the reasons we've not seen the investments necessary into grids over the past 5, 10, even longer than that, years ago, is because of the lack of planning and the lack of thinking through what's going to happen in the longer term. And I think this will link to something which perhaps we're going to discuss shortly, is on how do you come up with those credible plans and who decides and what models do you use to do that. Now, we've set out our net zero scenario. That is a very clear way in which the world comes towards net zero. It's only one possible pathway towards net zero. Lots of countries will have their own pathways. Others can, of course, disagree with many of the assumptions that we make. But I think making it clear what that pathway is, and so that whether it's private institutions, whether it's MDBs, whether it's whoever is making this finance, that they can be very clear in their minds, we are not making this investment, we are not supporting fossil fuels. We know where this is going to land. We know where this is going to come about. And until we have that slightly more nuanced conversation, depending upon those sort of credible pathways, we're going to kind of be stuck in the existing paradigm where we just don't get that, the money just isn't flowing in the right direction.
Absolutely, yeah. This is, as you say, something that I was hoping to ask again further down. Great, thanks a lot. So, yeah, if I could move on to the next question that I had, I guess quite a simple one. I don't know if the answer is simple, but what was the main motivation behind the common principles that's been adopted by jointly by all the MDBs?
Eugene, you go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, ultimately, the point of it is that we have multiple public institutions who are accounting for climate finance. And the purpose of these common principles is to adopt a methodology which is transparent and consistent and credible, and can be used amongst the other public finance institutions or more broadly. which then it fosters trust in understanding what we do count and what we don't count as towards climate action or climate finance. The most recent MDB common principles were updated because they're meant to be brought into line with the Paris Agreement, and it takes into consideration new mitigation requirements that are going to have to be put in place, but at the same time also trying to avoid the financing of investments which would or could lead to higher CO2 emissions. As has already been said, the grids do not distinguish specifically towards the types of generation that is being used or carried on the system. And so I think that it was a difficult job because you either take a bottom-up approach in which you can identify specific investments which you could say are more directly tied with climate mitigation activities. So connection to a renewable energy plant, that's quite obvious. But so also would be the reinforcement of transmission trunk lines to a whole region which is already developing renewables and is seen to develop more renewables in that area. And in order to evacuate power going forward, you need to reinforce that transmission lines all the way to that system, to that region, even in advance of the power plants that will be put in place. Those investments, I think, are more clearly linked, but it's harder when you want to say that same transmission line, which is being built for the transmission system, grid system, is also being used in order to accommodate growing demand of electricity in the country, and will also be carrying a generation from other power plants. And so I think that's where the difficulties come in, is to how to set a methodology which we could use, can be checked against. And we try in this case to sort of marry a bit of the two. One is, of course, direct connections. For example, at smart meters for homes, that could be considered automatically the type of investments that would facilitate energy efficiency. But then there's other investments that would require, that are mixed. And then instead of what was proposed here in this paper now, the new paper about looking at perhaps a modeling approach, without having gone to that direction, we looked at the EU taxonomy, which is a little bit more top down. So then you might say, okay, you want to look forward looking, the network is being used both for renewables, both for non-renewables, and really to the extent you can say that this country is decarbonizing, then the greater and faster it decarbonizes, the more you would expect the investments in the network to be accommodating and enabling that decarbonization. So you would expect a country that decarbonizes quickly to have more investments in the grid, which would be climate related. But that's a top-down approach, which we also have tried to incorporate. So I think that there's these polar opposites of very specific investments which you can identify versus an approach trying to take into consideration that there's a mixture. And that's what I think the MDB approach, common principles, tried to put forth. And I think that the proposal in the grid paper that is now put out is interesting and is certainly a valid alternative, which could again then be seen, because it would be transparent. You have modeling approaches as opposed to strategic plan approaches, but they have to go together in a sense. So I like the idea, but at the time, that's just what we proposed for the MDBs: transparency, consistency, credibility, and that was the main purpose of the common principles.
Great, thanks a lot, Eugene. Yeah, I think that clarifies it. Anything to add, or?
No, I just want to add that the principles are also together with the IDFC, so with the bilateral development agencies.
Okay, thanks a lot. And kind of leading on to that, I guess, kind of related to what you said, Eugene. What are some of the challenges with broadening the common principles out? So, for instance, if you wanted to increase potential project coverage, but then would we run into the issue that what Christophe was saying, where you kind of let some of these projects that might increase fossil fuel use temporarily, would those kind of sneak in? What are the potential challenges with broadening out the common principles?
Well, maybe one thing to add there, because let's say there is, of course, that potential risk, but we also now are going to work with a country to help them to establish a green certificate system. So basically that's also a system which then can help in the narrative on the that the additional green electricity is indeed a resultant of the increase in the network capacity, etc. So we should look beyond. So tracing the electron or the wave of electrons, that's hard. But we can at least meter how much renewables goes in the system and where notionally it would be taken out by the off-taker. And I think these type of systems can work in order to show and be transparent on what's the effect. The other element is that, and here I fully agree, if you electrify transport, industry, etc., then you increase the market size de facto for power. And I think market size in itself is of interest to investors. And it means that transport tariffs can maybe, let's say, distributed over a larger number of terawatt hours, and therefore indeed lower increase the utilization, etc. So I think these are all positive effects that need to be taken into account as well when doing the numbers. Of course, ideally we would all have very nice, let's say, power demand simulation models with the dispatch rules and with priority access to renewables and etc. But in a lot of countries, the actual data on the efficiencies of the plants is not kind of, let's say, when we see the IEA data, it's already a few years old. We need to see how we can make that more actual. So it's quite a bit of funding that would be required in doing increasing the precision, so to say, of the models, etc. But the best way, of course, is just to model the demand, the various sources, inputs, and then you just calculate what has been the fossil fuel use in the system, and then you have an idea what the emissions were. But again, these are very expensive studies and take a while, so they can take up to 2 years. So that's at least our experience. And the unfortunate thing is, we don't have 2 years. We only have 10 years to turn the system. So I think we also need to be a little bit. I think we're focusing sometimes too much on the risk of misalignment, whilst I think we have to take the risk of the misalignment in order to be able to move forward.
Yes, Monica.
Yeah, actually, Jan-Willem, thank you for saying that in the very end of your intervention. I was wanting to say that exactly that. We need to work along the lines that we need to take a little bit of a risk. I mean, if you compare it to anything else that is driven a little bit by a market surge, when I buy ecological milk, I know that there's a gray area where some milk that I buy under this flag might actually come from someone that didn't really meet the credit criteria or whatever. But at least I signal that I want my milk to be green. And in the same way, I think if you have an idea about who wants this green electricity and why and what are and how can they contribute, you can create a momentum for investing also in grids. I mean, you of course you have to invest in power supply from green power plants, but you will also have to acknowledge that sometimes it takes a grid also, and we know that the variable renewable energy power plants and the producers, they have, how can I say, they have higher expectations. They need a better grid than the traditional dispatchable power plant owners did and do. They can manage their power plant in a much they can be more elaborate with their dispatch, whereas the variable renewable energy needs a better grid. And in the same way, you can look at the demand side. Who are the drivers for buying green energy? Maybe it can be the transport sector. Maybe it can be the real estate sector. So just by communicating that this is what we here in, I don't know, Zambia or whatever, this is what we now sell as green electricity and based on these criteria. And I guess the average consumer will understand that this can entail some gray area. It can be some, statistical errors or whatever you do, but you have a clear communication, so you don't have to have all the technical bits 100% correct all the time, as long as you move in the right direction, not the wrong, in the right direction. Having said that, we don't want to see greenwashing, so you have to have some things right. You can't just say that this is green and then it isn't, but you have to take some risk. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you very much, Monica. Yes, Eugene.
I think one other point that we probably should highlight is that long-term planning is one of the problems with most of the countries we're looking at, and it's not just in terms of their strategic decarbonization planning, but also equally true with their electricity transmission and distribution planning. This long-term planning is necessary. It's been a weakness for quite a long time, but it's even more important now. If you're trying to decarbonize a system, you need to start really planning ahead for these systems. And I think that the importance of long-term planning is even higher now than in the past. And broadening, for example, as you answered, broadening common principles or adopting methodologies which encourage and may require element of long-term planning, either on the strategic level or also in the network level, is good, because it means if you're going to account for climate, if we wanted to have these types of planning tools put in place to identify the types of investments necessary, helps us to distinguish more more accurately the investments that are really being driven by decarbonization. But it also is useful to the countries involved. It's not just for us to do our accounting. It is for those countries to start planning those investments and getting the financing lined up and thinking in those terms. So I think in that way, it's very, very positive to encourage both longer term modeling of the systems for scenarios, as well as at the governmental level, strategic planning to put in place the type of policies and tariffs, regulations, etc., to encourage the types of investments you want to put in place.
Thanks, Eugene. Yes, Pauline.
Yes, thank you. Just to comment, AFD as an IDFC member, of course, is as that has been said, has adopted the CPs, and we really strongly support the CPs approach, which is based on a forward-looking approach, because before we were using carbon footprint assessment to assess whether or not a given green investment was climate, but it was really complex, a lot of uncertainties regarding the baseline scenario, and also the result of whether or not the carbon footprint of the carbon footprint assessment was very late in the appraisal process. So since at AFD we are driven by climate objectives, eventually the risk was to decide to stop financing grid projects, which is not what we want in the end, because we know that they are necessary for the climate transition. So when we reviewed the proposed CPs, clearly for us it made a lot of sense to adopt them to assess the climate benefits of our grid investments. We only made slight adjustments for greenfield projects, in particular to really give incentive to finance investments that do contribute to unlock renewable energy power plant investments in a given area of the grid in the short term, instead of investments that might accelerate investment in fossil fuel power plants in other areas of the grid. So this is something really that we are trying to test. We have a 2 years period of testing for the common principle within IDFC before officially join the common principle. So we are testing this approach. So far, we can see that it really helps to orient and to prioritize our green investments. So I'd be pleased to share further if you want, if you have questions on this approach. But we believe it is important also to look into this way of prioritizing the investments.
Okay, thanks a lot, Pauline. I don't know if there's anything to add, but I should also say we are starting to run out of time, unfortunately, and I want to make sure that we get to the audience questions. I do have other questions as well, but maybe we'll get to the audience questions first. So we'll go with the most upvoted one first. So I think this is to Monica about on the guidance for those seeking climate finance. So they've asked, will there be different versions of this guide, something clear for the NDA and something for practitioners? And then how you can blend and under what conditions? So yeah, will there be different versions of the guidance?
I'm in the audio mode. Thinking, is it the sector guide from GCF or is it the paper that the GDI has written? Just to check. Do we know this? Or maybe I can answer both. The sector guide from GCF is very broad and does not want to preempt any country-driven suggestions, but rather point in some direction, and then we would complement with readiness support to make to help countries to develop projects in line with our guidance and to help them quantify climate impact and to motivate the climate rationale. So that's for the GCF guidance. For the paper that we've just been working on now, we're far from ready, I would say, and there are good ideas, and I cannot at this stage say exactly how they will be applicable. And I have a very much respect for the potential problems and obstacles that may arise when you want to do this kind of forward-looking modeling, and maybe it turns out that it's too difficult. I don't know. So I'm not at the stage to give any specific guidance. I would be interested to understand who is asking, and if it's an NDA or planner, or if it's a financier, and please reach out bilaterally if you want to discuss more.
Message to the anonymous question asker who's got the most votes. Yeah, please reach out to Monica directly. And so I'm going to go to the next question. So this is on, so they've asked, there are new global grid models popping up. Can we get access to one to get a flavor of what an interconnector can do, such as costs, benefits, and emissions?
That's an academic question.
Yeah.
Steve will know.
Steve would know.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to answer this as well. I don't know if I'm allowed to.
Abby, I think you should answer.
Okay. Thanks, with your permission, Steve. So this is going to sound like a shameless plug, but we are building an osmosis global model right now, which is this open source energy systems model, and that'll be fully accessible and easy to use for anyone who wants to build a regional model, a country model, or a global model. Okay, that's the end of the plug. Okay, the next question is, sorry? Yeah, and it's also on GitHub. Okay, now that's the end of the plug. The third question is, how about if the grid improves economics and improves profit that are lower carbon, is that not enough? Brackets, money speaks louder than plans / NDCs, winky smiley. How about if the grid improves economics and improves profit that are lower carbon, isn't that enough?
Well, the question is how the lower carbon translates into revenue. And revenue will determine whether it's investable. And the cost, of course, of the investment and the OPEX, etc. So, but in order to inform, so a lot of the, again, transmission lines, distribution grids are in public hands. So it really matters what governments are planning and doing, also as to implementing regulations. And that will determine then whether there are indeed the revenues coming that would repay the investment done.
Okay, and then the next question I see is, if there are simple rules and principles in place now, why not have simplified modeling that is used to drive an annual update of the data and the models? I mean, it's kind of related to a question that I had. In the paper we propose a model-based approach. What are some of the challenges that you see with such an approach, maybe on data, credibility across the finance community?
I mean, I'm happy to say a few quick words on that. Just modeling isn't that simple, unfortunately. The process that we go through to develop our scenarios takes months and months. We mentioned the data issue. In many countries, and particularly in the case in many emerging market and developing economies, the data isn't that great. It takes a while to compile. There's sometimes a bit of a lag between when you would like it. I mean, we try to update our models every year to take into account the latest data that is available, but there are always assumptions there. And some people are very comfortable with those sorts of assumptions. Some people aren't very comfortable with those assumptions. And this is where people need to get a bit more comfortable with some of the modeling and scenario analysis that is done. I mean, just perhaps to broaden this slightly, you could even just look at, there's a whole cloud of different 1.5 net zero scenarios out there. These things range from, coal production can increase for the next 20 years and then it just drops off a cliff. Some other models, some other scenarios, coal production ceases by 2030. And you get a massive cloud, a massive range of and that's for coal in a net zero scenario. The envelope is huge. If the uncertainty is that big for coal, it's going to be much, much bigger for things more specific. The more specific you get, if you want to look at country detail, if you want to look at individual technologies, the uncertainty just explodes. So unfortunately, there's a case that modeling of this in a comprehensive way, it takes a bit of time, it takes resources. But saying all of that, one of the goals that we will have is to find the simplest way, the quickest way you can model this, which is sufficient. And there are tools like ourselves developing these, which hopefully can advance this, get us over that hump. They won't be perfect. Quite often people want perfection with this. They want certainty, and that's just not going to happen. And I think we need to recognise that that's not going to happen. And we have to kind of do the best with what we're going to be able to produce.
Thanks. Christophe. Yes. Eugene. Yeah.
We talk about modeling, but there's two elements of modeling here. One, which seems to be what you're discussing right now, is CO2 emissions estimates. And if we're talking about CO2 emissions estimates, of course, there's huge ranges that could be there. And so they're really just very rough. And you have to also remember the transmission and distribution investments are only part of the investments needed to get those savings. So if transmission and distribution represents, let's say, 15% of the costs of installing the power plants themselves, then they're not going to be attributed to all those CO2 emissions. They should be attributed pro rata to the total investment necessary to get the CO2 reduction. So there is an element there as to what percentage of the grid actually would count towards CO2. The other element of modeling is, what are the investments that can be attributed to the decarbonization? And that's much clearer because that's a technical type of modeling, which has to do with systems. And then you can identify specific investments that are absolutely needed for certain kinds of outcomes. And so I think there's two different modeling we're talking about simultaneously.
Any action?
Must be Friday.
Yeah. Sorry to our online panel members. I don't know if you could hear that, but there's a test of the fire alarm. There's a message about it, but apparently we don't have to take any action. So, Monica, please. And I should also say that we've pretty much run out of time, so this is already on borrowed time. So.
Oh, I'll be very quick. I just want to say two things. One is that I want to challenge Monty a little bit on that grid is only enabling. We have seen so many rural electrification projects where you bring a grid and the economy boom, and so you're actually proactively creating economic activity and many other things. So the grid is also contributing to development and does actually actively make a difference. The other thing I wanted to add to this modeling and data thing is in areas where you have power pooling in markets, that helps because then you build data, because then you have a market and you have someone who's interested to have the day after value or whatever kind of market model you have. So you will build data. So I think to some extent to bring in the customer and give the customer the opportunity to select green electricity will move us towards the data will be developed, I think, if you have someone who wants to be able to, price their offering.
Thanks a lot, Monica. I should let you know that it was a bit interrupted with the fire announcements here, but I think we got the key messages. But thanks. It's unfortunate that we've run out of time. I think it would have been great to keep this discussion going. And thank you very much to all our panel members and speakers, for participating today. Also patiently dealing with my emails, pestering you all week. But I do look forward to kind of pestering you in the future about working on this together. But thank you very much. It was fantastic as always with our discussions. And thanks to the audience, organizers. Thank you.
Thank you.